What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the macro developments coming out of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those who are watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and a big part of my job requires that I follow those macro developments. So if that is something that you are interested in, and if you want to be just as informed as my clients, maybe consider subscribing. Everyone else, it's good to see you. End of week episode. We've got several stories to cover this week. Last week was a very heavy US-China relations, US-China policy episode. So this episode, we're not going to dive too much into the China-US stuff, but there is plenty of other material to cover. So we're going to just dive right into it. As always, if you guys enjoy the episode, it's a huge help if you smash the like button. Unfortunately, YouTube considers this sort of content sensitive content, discussing what's going on in China, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it will not promote it. The only way it can really be promoted is if you guys hit that like button and share. Unfortunately, because I'm also a new YouTuber, it's just going to be an extra hard uphill battle, but that's okay. I am glad for those of you who do watch this, and I appreciate you coming and watching and commenting and everything else. And also to my Patreon supporters, you guys are absolutely awesome. Thank you so much. It's very humbling to have your guys' support. Okay, with all that said, let's jump into this week's China update. Okay, let's begin again, as we always do, with an update regarding the COVID outbreak in the north of China. After a few thousand new local cases across the north, these are official cases, I should say, in the northeast of the country over the last month, this week new local cases dropped from about 150 per day to approximately 50 per day, according to official numbers at least. And remember, these are official government numbers we're talking about here. Daily cases are being discovered in Heilongjiang and Jilin, bordering Russia and North Korea respectively, and Hebei, which hugs Beijing, as well as the capital itself, albeit in outer districts of Shunyi and Daxing of Beijing. Sporadic local cases have also been discovered in the northern provinces of Shandong and Shanxi, as well as the megacity of Shanghai. While this current wave of infections does seem to be under control for now, the upcoming Spring Festival period is making a lot of officials nervous. On Tuesday, the Civil Aviation Administration of China said that passengers in China with flight bookings scheduled between January 28th through March 8th are able to request full refunds or reschedule their flights for free. The Ministry of Transport this week estimates that 1.15 billion trips are going to be made during this year's Spring Festival period, around 60% less than the nearly 3 billion journeys that we saw in 2019 in the mainland, and 20% less than 2020. Beijing started a second round of mass nuclear acid testing in Daxing district on Tuesday in an effort to contain the spread of COVID there, a resurgence that we've seen in those the outer districts of Beijing over the last week and a half. On the same day, a court in Beijing in Shunyi district sentenced a PRC citizen in her 30s to 1 year imprisonment for, quote, concealing COVID-19 symptoms before boarding a flight to China, end quote. The restrictions imposed to control the spread of the virus is seeing all sorts of negative economic consequences and effects, including most recently food inflation. Certain vegetable prices and pork have almost doubled in price compared to a year ago, according to the latest statistics from the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. Next up, the great debate around growth targets in China continues. On Monday, Ma Jun, former chief economist at the People's Bank of China, the PRC's central bank, gave a speech stressing a number of risks facing the PRC economy. He was particularly concerned with the continuation of setting GDP targets, which would likely worsen debt risks among local governments and increase financial risk across the entire economic system in the mainland. He recommended that Beijing focus on stabilizing employment and controlling inflation as main macroeconomic policy goals rather than setting growth targets. He wasn't alone in expressing this sentiment this week. This week, a prominent think tank head in Beijing said that rising house prices, a major driver of the economy, are, quote, politically not acceptable. And in fact, over the last 7 days alone, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Hangzhou, the provincial capital of Zhejiang, and Hefei, the provincial capital of Anhui, have all introduced new control policies to curb housing speculation. The following day, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology said it would, quote, resolutely suppress steel production, end quote, an input to infrastructure, another unproductive driver of growth. Taishin Media also reports this week that sources say that Beijing is planning on banning local governments from further credit expansion except when paying off older debt. This is a tool in which the local governments have met growth targets in the past. Now, despite all these words and these actions that are coming from these different players across the government, it seems likely that a de facto growth rate may still be imposed even if it isn't official. This week, state-run CGTN published, quote, "Several of China's provincial-level governments are aiming to notch year-on-year gross domestic product GDP growth of more than 6% this year. Lawmakers said as they convened their annual legislative meetings, Guangdong province is targeting economic growth of more than 6% this year. Hainan said on Sunday that its economic growth would be no less than 10% in 2021. And in another piece, quote, "Shanxi plans to grow its economy by 8%, while Henan is aiming at least 7% growth. Fujian has set its economic growth target at about 7.5%. End quote. Now, due to the fact that many of these local economies will be starting from a relatively low base after 2020 performance, and due to pent-up consumption, higher household saving rates in the previous 12 months, many provinces should be able to meet these targets year on year in the first 2 quarters of this year, 2021. Through healthy growth. That is growth from consumption, exports, and private sector investment. This is assuming, of course, too, that there isn't another major nationwide lockdown due to a massive outbreak of COVID. If that was the case, it would change everything. However, in order to maintain these high growth rate targets into the 3rd and 4th quarters of this year and beyond, local governments would need to turn back to the traditional unhealthy drivers of growth: housing speculation and unproductive government infrastructure spending. So we can see an intensifying debate among top officials across central and local government between whether to set political growth rates to maintain high growth and social stability, or allow regular, healthier, and slower growth to reduce what is already a very serious financial situation or financial risk situation. Okay guys, now it's time for the quote of the week. Are you ready for this one? Quote, "What should be noted is that since the National People's Congress Standing Committee adopted the national security law in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, you have led the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government in resolutely enforcing it, stopping violence and chaos in accordance with the law and working to bring Hong Kong back on track. Hong Kong's transition from chaos to stability has once again demonstrated that the principle of patriots governing Hong Kong must always be upheld to ensure the steady and sustained implementation of one country, 2 systems. General Secretary Xi Jinping." Speaking of Xi, the General Secretary gave a speech at a virtual Davos meeting this week. Now, as we look at what Xi said, we can see Xi here trying to present China as a preferred alternative to the US, the hope being to prevent effective multilateralism between the US and its allies in future US-China policy under a Biden administration. Remember, this speech that Xi Jinping gave has been written for an international, liberal, and economic elite audience. The language employed by Xi's team reflects this. It is very different to the language that we've seen him use when speaking to a domestic audience, particularly the party and PLA leadership. Quote, "No 2 leaves in the world are identical, and no histories, cultures, or social systems are the same. Each country is unique in its own history, culture, and social system, and none is superior to the other. What does ring the alarm is arrogance, prejudice, and hatred. It is the attempt to impose hierarchy on human civilization or to force one's own history, culture, and social system upon others. We should stay committed to openness and inclusiveness instead of closeness and exclusion. We should stay committed to international law and international rules instead of one seeking one's own supremacy." End quote. Then he moved on to another area of concern for Beijing: technology and supply chain decoupling. Quote, "Scientific and technological advances should benefit all humanity rather than be used to curb and contain other countries' development. China will think and act with more openness with regard to international exchange and cooperation on science and technology. We will work with other countries to create an open, free, equitable, and non-discriminatory environment for scientific and technological advancement that is beneficial to all and shared by all." On this point, literally the same day that Xi Jinping gave this speech, Jian Jinquan, the head of the ideology school of the CCP, the Central Policy Research Office, published a major commentary in the state-run study Times, 学习时报, on the need to achieve technology, self-reliance, and control, writing, quote, To implement the strategy of self-reliance, we need to dispose of dependence on foreign countries, especially Western countries, in technology, equipment, parts, and other areas. We must realize the fundamental transformation of China's overall scientific and technological level from chasing to leading, and firmly grasp the initiative of technological progress and industrial development in our own hands. End quote. There was also another interesting line in Xi Jinping's speech, quote, China will continue to promote a new type of international relations. End quote. The General Secretary did not elaborate on what he meant by this, however. For many Westerners and Asian peoples that border the PRC, Xi's words in the speech may well be met with many eye rolls or eye rolling. After all, previous Xi Jinping Davos speeches have fueled promise fatigue with many. However, we shouldn't forget that for many developing nations outside of the Asia region, places like South America, Eastern Europe, Africa, etc., Xi still may have a supportive audience in some quarters. Rhodium Group has published an outstanding report on US-China investments this week. It's worth taking a quick look at the report, observations, and conclusions. Quote, US holdings of Chinese securities neared 1.2 trillion at the end of 2020. We estimate that US investors held 1.1 trillion in equity and 100 billion in debt securities issued by Chinese entities at the end of 2020. Chinese holdings of US securities reached as much as 2.1 trillion. We estimate Chinese investors held 700 billion in equity and 1.4 trillion in debt securities issued by US entities at the end of 2020. End quote. Regarding continued financial integration, the report's authors concluded, quote, Beijing has stated its preference for greater financial opening to the world, but needs to enact far-reaching reforms before it can truly open its capital account without guardrails. Washington has traditionally taken a very liberal approach to financial globalization, but a new era of strategic competition with China has led to a redrawing of national security boundaries, including in the economic and financial space. A new US administration is unlikely to fully realize this shift, but may strike a better balance between mitigating national security risks, incentivizing good financial governance, and preserving the benefits from benign linkages. End quote. Now, like I said at the beginning of the episode, in the last episode, it was very US-China policy, US-China relations heavy. So I just wanted to touch briefly this week on comments made by members of Biden's incoming team. During her confirmation hearing, US President Biden's nominee to head the Commerce Department, Gina Raimondo, spoke on her view on the role of economic sanctions in the China-US relationship, telling senators, quote, China's actions have been anti-competitive, hurtful to American workers and businesses, coercive, and, goes on to say, culpable for atrocious human rights abuses. So whether it's the entry list or tariffs or countervailing duties, I intend to use all these tools, punitive tariffs and export restrictions, to the fullest extent possible, end quote. Also, at a Senate hearing Wednesday on her nominations as the United Nations ambassador for the US, Linda Thomas Greenfield called China, quote, a strategic adversary, end quote, that threatens the world, and expressed that the US should act, quote, aggressively against Chinese malign efforts in New York, end quote. And last up, some concerns at the Periphery. Over the weekend, last weekend that is, Taiwan's military said that 4 PLA fighter jets, 8 bombers and 1 anti-submarine aircraft entered its air defense identification zone and crossed the Taiwan Strait midline. The following day, on Sunday, 12 fighters, 2 anti-submarine aircraft and a reconnaissance plane did the same. In response, the US State Department urged Beijing to, quote, cease its military, diplomatic and economic pressure against Taiwan and instead engage in meaningful dialogue with Taiwan's democratically elected representatives, end quote. Very boilerplate sort of response from the Defense Department from the US. Now, this statement was then analyzed by the Chinese side, and state media expressed, quote, Chinese mainland experts said the statement is a key clarification of the Biden administration's stance on the Taiwan question. And while it showed that the US is not giving up on its continued interference in China's internal affairs over the Taiwan question, it also indicated the new US administration seems willing to keep a certain level of ambiguity on the Taiwan question, which provides the possibility for China and the US to form a level of tacit understanding. End quote. On Monday, the US declassified documents detailing the security assurances it made to Taiwan in 1982. This is likely designed as a warning to Beijing. Over the weekend, last weekend too, Indian media reported that a skirmish between Chinese and Indian troops on the Himalayan border near Sikkim occurred several days before. Reports suggest soldiers on both sides were wounded, but there were no casualties reported. Not many details have been provided, especially from the PRC side. Okay guys, that's the episode for this week. Sorry I'm a little bit low energy. It's been a crazy busy week, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Wherever you are, as always, stay safe, stay sane. I'll see you guys next time on China Update.